The hall didn't just fall silent. It held its breath. Inside, St. James's Palace, a place wrapped in velvet history, where kings are made and empires once whispered, secrets the air turned dense, as if London itself paused to listen. Red drapes shimmered under antique chandelier. Gold accents clung to the wood like time refused to pass. It was regal, majestic, but tonight, something felt off. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't routine. It was something else entirely. Two flags stood side by side on stage one. The iconic Union Jack, centuries of empire wrapped in red, white, and blue. The other, bold with pride and purpose, the national flag of Burkina Faso. They didn't flutter. They stood still, like witnesses. At the center of it all stood King Charles III. Poised, controlled, the kind of presence that doesn't need to raise its voice. And next to him was Ibrahim Traoré, younger, quieter, but not lesser. He didn't move much. He didn't smile. But somehow, he filled the room with more weight than the crown itself. The press thought this was going to be a photo op, a polite moment, a diplomatic nod, a handshake to symbolize goodwill. That's what always happened in rooms like this. But not today. Today, the past and the future were about to speak in the same room. King Charles leaned forward, just slightly, a calculated motion. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You stand before the British crown, he said. You'll bow to what this institution represents. Order, history, civilization. No one gasped. No one blinked. But suddenly, the tension cracked wide open. Because everyone in that room knew. This wasn't just about one man asking another to bow. This was the voice of empire, speaking to the world it once ruled. Traoré didn't flinch, didn't scoff, didn't smirk. He stepped forward just a few inches, but it felt like a leap through centuries. I don't bow, he said, voice low and steady. I build. And just like that, the room changed. A journalist's pen slipped to the floor. Cameras clicked. But no one was smiling anymore. That sentence, just 4 words, didn't echo. It landed. Each word was a nail in the coffin of old assumptions. King Charles narrowed his eyes. Not in anger, but in recognition. He saw it. This wasn't theater. This wasn't grandstanding. This was real. Traoré hadn't come to dance around diplomacy. He hadn't come for applause. He came to say something the palace hadn't heard in a long time. We're not beneath you anymore. There were no insults, no shouting, just 2 men, one wearing centuries of tradition, and the other carrying generations of silence. Now broken. And outside those palace walls, thousands listened. Through live streams, through radios, through open windows in neighborhoods far beyond London. Inside, no one dared interrupt. Not the aides, not the advisors, because somehow the velvet and gold had been stripped away, and all that remained was truth. Raw, indéniable. The world thought this would be ceremonial, but what it got was a confrontation written in history, framed by silence, and delivered with the weight of a man who didn't come to bow. He came to build. The silence that followed was electric, not dead, not empty. It was the kind of silence that waits for someone to flinch, to blink, to retreat. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't move. He stood tall in the Hall of Kings, surrounded by marble, portraits, and chandeliers, symbols of conquest, polished to perfection. And he stared directly into the eyes of the monarch, whose ancestors once divided the world with ink and arrogance. King Charles III tilted his head. Just slightly. His tone didn't change. But there was a shift, subtle, deliberate, like a man reminding the room who'd been sitting on thrones while the rest of the world was learning to walk. "I admire resolve," the king said. "But nations aren't built on slogans. They're built on continuity, on heritage. That's what the crown represents, the spine of civilization." The words glided across the room like silk polished, rehearsed, inherited. But Traoré didn't blink, didn't even shift his weight. Instead, he stepped toward the podium, both hands resting lightly on the wood. His voice, low and controlled. "You speak of continuity," he said, "but it was your continuity that erased mine." The temperature dropped. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. A flicker. A flicker passed across the king's face. Not fear, not anger, something older. Guilt, maybe. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the far wall. There, behind a glass case, hung a towering portrait of Queen Victoria, the sovereign who presided over Britain's greatest expansion, and its deepest scars, as if her ghost might step down and offer a rebuttal. But she didn't. "I don't deny history," Charles said slowly, "but we mustn't be prisoners to it. Britain has evolved." He paused just long enough to sound generous. That's when Traoré's voice cut through like a scalpel. "You offer partnership. Only if we speak your language. Sign your contracts. Sit at your tables. And follow your rules." The weight of that truth, crippling, not just for the crown, but for every nation that had ever been invited to the table after their own had been stolen. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, but no one looked away. Then came the dagger. "You say the crown protects civilization," Traoré said, "but it was the crown that once burned ours." He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He was exact. Charles didn't move, but his grip on the lectern tightened just slightly. A twitch at the knuckle. Not loud, but not hidden. Then, for the first time, the king asked a question that wasn't wrapped in ceremony. "Then, what do you propose?" Traoré didn't hesitate. He didn't grandstand. He didn't circle the podium like a politician. He simply said, "Not revenge, not war, just truth and freedom." King Charles narrowed his eyes. "And your definition of that freedom?" he asked. A note of caution behind the curiosity. Traoré turned not toward Charles, but toward the cameras. Toward the world. One that doesn't need a crown to feel powerful. And just like that, the conversation left the room. It spilled into the streets, into schools, into newsrooms, into dinner tables and community centers outside the palace. The crowd had grown. Supporters, skeptics, students, protesters packed shoulder to shoulder behind barricades, phones in hand, radios crackling. They weren't watching a ceremony anymore. They were watching a moment they knew their children would ask about. Inside, King Charles stared at the man who had just drawn a line through centuries, not with violence, but with vocabulary. You carry your words like weapons. The king finally said, but do you understand the weight of governance, of restraint? And that's when Traoré's mask peeled back just a little. I carried weapons, long before I carried words, he said, and I know the weight of governance better than those who inherited thrones, without ever surviving hunger, invasion, or betrayal. There it was. Not défiance, experience. Not theater, memory. And for the first time that night, King Charles didn't respond immediately, because suddenly, this wasn't about crowns. It was about cost, the cost of rule, the cost of silence, the cost of pretending the past had no price. For a moment, King Charles stood frozen in the space between pride and pause. His robes still shimmered, his presence still dignified, but something had shifted. You could feel it in the silence. It wasn't the quiet of fear. It was the quiet of truth. He straightened his cuffs, an old royal reflex, a signal of composure. But this wasn't a banquet. This was a reckoning. You assume inheritance is ease, he said softly. It is not. The crown isn't a shelter. It is scrutiny. It is sacrifice. Ibrahim Traoré didn't break eye contact. No, he replied. It's insulation from storms you never had to survive. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because when a man speaks from lived fire, volume is a luxury. I grew up with sand in my teeth, he continued, and gunfire for lullabies. The crown was never a shield for me. It was a shadow. That line landed like a quiet thunderclap. No outrage, no rebuttal. Just the echo of lives that had never made it into textbooks. A royal advisor behind Charles shifted nervously. But the king raised a hand. He didn't want defense. Not this time. Then what would you have me do? He asked. Apologize for a past I didn't create. Traoré shook his head. Slowly, calmly. No. But stop using it to justify the influence you no longer deserve. Those words didn't explode. They cracked the architecture. You could almost hear the portraits lining the grand chamber lean forward. You see, Traoré said, walking slowly across the stage. Your power lives in portraits, in memory, in ceremony. Mine lives in people, in those who have nothing and are still standing. Charles followed him with his eyes, more curious now than combative. Not watching a threat, but watching a shift. A fault line that wouldn't stay buried. You want to bury the past, he said carefully. Traoré stopped walking, turned. No, I want to stop it from wearing a crown. A hush fell over the room like snowfall. Outside, a drizzle began to tap against the palace windows, as if even the London sky wanted in on the conversation. Traoré looked around at the chamber's grandeur portraits of empire makers in robes and medals. Gold-framed legacies. You frame your legacy in silk, he said. Mine is framed in dust, in graves unmarked by history books. Charles's jaw clenched. But he didn't interrupt. The crown doesn't owe me a favor. Traoré continued. It owes the world an answer. That line cut through the palace like a blade wrapped in velvet. Finally, the king replied. And you believe you're the one to demand it. Traoré turned fully, standing squarely in front of him. I don't demand, he said. I reveal. The room stirred. Seasoned diplomats leaned forward. Journalists clutched their pens but forgot to write. Because this wasn't a press event anymore. It was history unfolding. Undressed, unafraid, Charles took a breath. You mistake defiance for leadership. And you mistake heritage for virtue. Traoré en serre. It was a duel. Not of weapons, but of words each sharper than steel. Traoré stepped closer. Leadership isn't passed down in palaces. It's earned, on roads without names. In silence. After the bombs stop falling. Not in applause. After a coronation. Charles didn't respond with words. He responded with respect. Not open. Not warm. But real. The kind of respect a man gives when he realizes the battlefield has changed and he's no longer the only one holding the pen. I've spent a lifetime preparing to lead. The king said. Traoré met his eyes. And I've spent a lifetime never expecting to survive. Their eyes locked. Two timelines. Two truths. One throne. No longer big enough for both. Charles turned slightly. Eyes now aimed not at Traoré, but at the cameras behind him. What do you want? Mr. Traoré, he asked. Genuinely now. An empire to kneel, a crown to shatter. Traoré's voice dropped. No, he said. I want the world to know. The difference between rule and respect. And just like that, the room wasn't a royal hall anymore. It was a courtroom, a confession booth, a battlefield of memory, but most of all, it was a mirror. And no one, not even a king, could look away. The room no longer belonged to royalty. It belonged to the silence between two men. One born into power, the other forged in its absence. And yet, they stood now, not as ruler and subject, but as reflections of a shifting world. King Charles, still upright, still composed, narrowed his gaze. The world, he said slowly, is still run by rooms like this. By men who speak softer than you, but strike harder. Ibrahim Traoré didn't blink. I know, he said, but I didn't come here to win your rooms. I came so my people never have to beg to enter them again. That line hit the heart of the room like thunder wrapped in velvet. No shouting, no protest signs, just a sentence that made empires shift in their chairs. For a moment, Charles said nothing. Then something unexpected. He extended his hand. It wasn't a royal command. It wasn't even a gesture of control. It was a question. Traoré looked at it, measured it, not with suspicion, with clarity. Then he stepped forward, and they shook hands. Not as allies, not as enemies, but as two men who understood history had heard them both. I still believe in the crown, Charles said quietly, and I believe in people. Traoré replied, that's why I lead. Not for applause, but so they don't have to bow anymore. Their hands released, but the weight of that handshake didn't drop. It lingered in the gold trim, the red curtains, the marble columns like a ghost, finally invited to speak. The clock above the chamber door ticked. Outside, the crowd pressed closer. The rain had picked up. London was listening. What will you do? Charles asked. If the world tries to silence you, Traoré stepped away from the podium. Then turned steady, calm, unshaken. Then I'll build louder. The simplicity of that answer sent chills, because it wasn't a threat. It was a promise, a reminder that power no longer lived only in castles and courts. It lived in conviction, in communities rising, in the silences that refused to stay silent. Charles stood motionless. You could feel the tension drop. But something deeper take its place, reflection. Then a voice from the back of the room broke through. Un journaliste. Mr. Traoré. She called out. Did you come here to threaten the crown? He turned slightly. Not smiling. Not dodging. No, he said. I came to remind it that the world has more than one center. Up in the palace window, King Charles stood again. Alone now. No aides. No council. Just a man and his crown, separated by velvet and time. He looked down on the crowd, saw the cameras, the signs, the faces of people who had never known palaces, but understood what was happening in one, and inside. One advisor whispered, "Shall we release a statement?" Charles raised one hand. Not yet, because sometimes a pause speaks louder than a proclamation. Down the marble steps, Traoré walked toward his waiting convoy. He didn't wave. He didn't perform. Because the message had already landed, and it wasn't in the headlines. It was in the hearts of the people watching. The crown stood tall. The world would say, but Traoré stood taller. Not because he was louder, but because he spoke for the unheard. And somewhere in the crowd, a child waved a handmade flag. It wasn't of a country, it was of an idea. Traoré saw it. And for the first time that day, he smiled, not for cameras, not for claps, for the future, because that's what he came to build. And the palace, the very symbol of old power, had listened, not by choice, but by truth. By the time Ibrahim Traoré's convoy turned the corner, the rain had begun to fall harder. Not a storm, but something softer. Like the sky itself was grieving. Or maybe awakening. Inside the palace, the air was thicker than ever. King Charles hadn't moved from the window. Not because he was frozen, but because he wasn't ready to pretend yet. In that hall of mirrors and memories, something had cracked, not out of anger, but out of realization. He turned slowly, eyes falling on the crown behind him, still resting on its pedestal, still untouched, still heavy. I never asked for silence, he said quietly, but perhaps I accepted it too long. No one replied, because everyone in the room knew this wasn't a moment for counsel. This was a moment for reckoning. And outside, Traoré kept walking, not toward victory, not away from conflict, but forward toward purpose. He didn't need the last word. He'd already planted it like a seed in every soul that had ever waited too long to be heard. A reporter shouted through the chaos, "Mr. Traoré, what will history say about today?" He paused, turned. That it hurt us both. No defiance, no bravado. Just the quiet confidence of a man who had stood inside the empire's heart and refused to bow. Back inside, Charles moved toward the center of the chamber. His steps were slower now. Not weaker. Just more aware. He approached the crown, not with reverence, but with reflection. "You came here to challenge me," he had said earlier, and Traoré had answered, I came to remind you, not everyone is waiting for your permission to rise. Those words wouldn't leave the room. They were carved now, somewhere deeper than stone, into memory, into meaning. And then came the line that would outlive every headline. I don't hate the crown, Traoré had said. I hate the silence it demands. That was the difference. This hadn't been a rebellion. It had been a reveal, a mirror held up to power, asking, do you still know what you reflect? Charles finally spoke again, this time to no one in particular. You've made your stand clear, he said, but the world still runs on diplomacy, on caution, on rooms like this. And if there was an answer in the room, it came not from an aide, not from a scribe, but from the silence itself. That may be true, but not forever, because something had shifted, not violently, not loudly, but permanently. Traoré had walked into a palace built on centuries of tradition and left without touching a single artifact. Yet the entire room had been rearranged. Not physically, philosophically. And outside, a child held up a homemade sign. We build now. It wasn't a protest. It was a blueprint. Because that was Traoré's gift to the world, not destruction, but direction, not opposition. Definition. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't apologize for presence. He didn't plead to be seen. He stood, and the world watched. And the crown, for the first time in a long time, listened. Closing hook for narration. They say crowns are symbols, but so is silence. And when one man breaks it, he doesn't just speak for himself. He speaks for every voice that was ever told to wait, for every nation once told to kneel, for every future waiting to be built, because maybe the world doesn't need more rulers. Maybe it needs more builders. And Traoré didn't come for power. He came for truth. And sometimes, truth doesn't knock. It walks in and rewrites the room. The doors of St. Thome, James's palace, closed behind Ibrahim Traoré with a sound that echoed louder than thunder. But inside, it was even louder. Not in noise, but in meaning. The chamber had gone still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from awakening. For a long moment, King Charles III remained where he was, his back to the room, his eyes locked on the empty podium. The conversation was over, but its weight hadn't left. It lingered in the velvet, in the gold trim, in the shadows of every portrait on those walls. One of his senior advisors finally spoke. We should prepare a response. Your Majesty. Charles raised one hand. Calm. Precise. No. Not yet. He walked slowly to the pedestal where the crown sat untouched throughout the entire encounter. He didn't reach for it. He didn't put it on. He simply looked at it. For the first time, not as a right, but as a question. Outside, the world was already changing. Reporters flooded the airwaves. Headlines began their race. Traoré confronts the crown, a king and a challenger, not a bow, a build. But none of those lines could capture what people actually felt. Because in homes, in schools, in shops and streets, they weren't talking about politics. They were talking about presence, about what it means to walk into a room you were never invited to, and speak anyway. And to speak with dignity, not dominance, with truth, not theater. In Accra, A university professor paused mid-lecture to stream the footage. In Dakar, a boy rewound the same 10 seconds, 10 times the moment, Traoré said. I don't hate the crown. I hate the silence it demands. And in a cafe in Brooklyn, 2 women cried not out of sadness, but because they recognized something in Traoré's voice they hadn't heard in a long time. A leader who didn't need to win to be powerful. Back in the palace, Charles sat quietly, a younger Ada, bolder than the rest, finally spoke. Your Majesty. With respect, do you think he went too far? Charles didn't answer right away. He looked at the paintings again, the eyes of monarchs who never imagined this kind of conversation. He didn't go too far, Charles said finally. He just didn't stop where we expected. And that was the point. Traoré hadn't come to rebel. He came to remind that power, real power, does not always announce itself with parades or processions. Sometimes, it walks in with a voice and shifts the entire floor beneath your feet. He didn't shatter the crown. He didn't demand reparations. What he asked for was something far more dangerous to systems built on silence. To be heard without permission, to speak truth without apology. To build, not to bow. And that was something no empire had ever been ready for. Down the street from the palace, a child was still holding a flag, not of a nation, but of an idea. It was handmade. Crooked lines. The word dignity scribbled in red. A BBC camera zoomed in on the boy. Why are you here? The reporter asked. The child answered softly. Because someone like me finally got to speak. That was the story. Not diplomacy. Not scandal. Not even confrontation. It was about what happens when truth walks in, wearing no crown, no medals, no inheritance, only conviction. And the palace with all its walls and wealth couldn't stop it, because it didn't come to destroy. It came to build what history had forgotten to leave space for, and as Traoré's car rolled into the mist of the London evening, he didn't smile. He didn't wave. But in the quiet of that moment, he whispered 4 words, not to the cameras, not to the crowd, but to the future itself. We speak from now. Later that night, King Charles returned alone to the chamber. No entourage. No crown. Just a man standing before a chair that once ruled the world. He stared into the silence Traoré had left behind, not empty, but echoing. And for the first time in decades, the monarchy didn't respond with a statement, it responded with a pause, because something had been built that day. Not a rebellion, not a revolution, a line, and the world would remember who dared to draw it, not with fury, not with force, but with truth, and truth does not bow.